Mental health workers of Reddit, what is the scariest mental health condition you have encountered?
A 10-year-old boy presented with very typical to above-average intelligence, looks, personality, etc. He seemed like any other kid you'd see in a school, and you wouldn't think anything was wrong with him. He was placed in our residential treatment center after a chilling incident where he hid his infant half-sister in a chest freezer and refused to tell anyone where she was. Thankfully, she was found quickly and was okay. But during the entire search, while his parents were frantically searching and pleading with him to reveal her location, he calmly sat there, with a small smile on his face, refusing to speak. There was no history of abuse, neglect, or any known injuries, either from birth or any other kind. When asked why he did it, he simply said, "Because I could." He took pleasure in watching the terror on his father and stepmother's faces. While at our facility, he also exhibited disturbing behavior towards his younger roommate, making threats and engaging in harmful actions. He terrorized the roommate, saying he would harm their family if they told anyone. As a result, the judge gave his parents a difficult choice: either he would be registered as a sex offender, or his DNA would be placed on file in a database. I believe they opted for the latter. I've kept an eye out for his name in the news. This was a case of someone who seemed to be born with a very particular nature, someone who appeared to have no empathy, a person with sociopathic tendencies. He was, by far, the most disturbing child I've ever encountered in 20 years of working with at-risk youth. I've dealt with children who were angry, who had behavioral issues, or who had experienced trauma or brain injuries. They all had reasons for their actions: intense abuse, neglect, or diagnoses like RAD or autism. But this boy, he could charm the world and still be a threat in the background. Not a mental health worker, but adjacent. I was working at a homeless shelter when a man who was staying with us, struggling with schizophrenia, had a really tough time. His providers kept changing his medications, switching him from one to another, or failing to fill his prescriptions. This led him to spiral badly. He eventually stole a knife from the kitchen and, in a moment of distress, harmed himself. Thankfully, he survived, but it was an incredibly scary situation. Clients who were in nearby beds said they heard him arguing with himself, saying things like, "I won't hurt these people, you can't make me," and similar phrases. It seemed like he was trying to protect others in the shelter from whatever he was battling inside his mind. It was a deeply unsettling and heartbreaking experience. He was a kind man, and he truly deserved better care and support than what he received. I used to work as a clinician in a jail. I was conducting a suicide risk assessment on a young man who had been charged with strangling his mother. The first time I met him, I spoke to him through his cell door. He reported hearing command hallucinations telling him to hurt people. The next day, I assessed him right outside his cell as he was coming back from court, with a deputy present. He seemed calm, alert, and optimistic. He was aware of what happened at court and told me that his aunt was going to post his bond. Halfway through the conversation, I noticed a sudden shift in his demeanor. Looking back at camera footage, I realized I had unconsciously taken a step back. Without warning, he lunged towards me, attempting to grab my neck. I ran down the hallway, and he ran in the opposite direction, only to be tackled by the deputy. His eyes still haunt me.
I used to work at a stage school for students with severe disabilities. I had students of all ages, and one particular student could become extremely violent. I suspected there were some undiagnosed conditions contributing to his behavior. He was a big boy, 6 feet tall, 250 pounds, and very strong. Despite this, he was so sweet. He would come up to me and give me a hug or rest his head on my shoulder. We had these big red mats, about 5 feet tall, which we used for protection if students became violent, to keep them and everyone else safe. One day, he came up to me and handed me a mat. I started to lean it against the wall, but he grabbed it, handed it back to me, and tapped the top edge. His eyes were filled with tears, and he looked at the floor. When he looked up moments later, something in his eyes had changed. They were completely different. It wasn't him anymore. Suddenly, I found myself fighting against all 250 pounds of him. He was trying to claw, bite, kick, hit, anything he could do to hurt me. He was also trying to attack other students. Thankfully, my adrenaline kicked in, and I don't know how we made it through. The episode lasted about 10 minutes. Then, he sat down on the floor and began to cry. His familiar, gentle brown eyes returned. I felt so helpless for him. He was mostly nonverbal and had very limited cognitive function. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Whenever these episodes occurred, his eyes would turn dark, and he would start pounding the ground with his fists like a gorilla. It was truly terrifying. Some days, it felt like we were honestly fighting off the strength of the biggest, most powerful animal. The episodes would last a while, and then he would sit down, exhausted, and cry. OCD. I had a 20-year-old client who was tortured by his own mind, and no medication seemed to help. He would get trapped in endless loops of asking if everything would be okay, but he couldn't accept any answer other than yes, it's going to be okay. If you tried to answer in any other way, he would yell over you, repeating the question with increasing panic until you gave the correct answer. Then, the whole cycle would start over again. It was heartbreaking to witness, and it absolutely tore his family apart. Then came the intrusive thoughts about his younger sister. The poor guy hated himself for making his family suffer so much, and the thoughts he was having caused him so much distress that he attempted to end his life multiple times. He tried once before being admitted, and then twice during the short periods between discharge and readmission. On his fourth attempt, he succeeded in ending his life. I've never seen a family so torn between grief, guilt, and relief.
As a psychologist/therapist, anorexia nervosa is one of the most frightening mental health conditions I've worked with. It's also one of the deadliest. There are many people now struggling with eating disorders, and it's heartbreaking and incredibly difficult for everyone going through it. However, the classic form of restrictive anorexia nervosa can be almost like a form of psychosis. These individuals starve themselves to the point of death, and it often feels like there's nothing you can do to stop it. They don't see themselves as sick, and they can't perceive their bodies as they truly are. Sometimes, it feels as though the condition is unstoppable. What's even more terrifying is how some people with anorexia can survive for so long without food, overexercising, and undereating for extended periods. Most people, thankfully, would pass out or struggle too much to keep this cycle going. But it's chilling how their bodies can resist the damage until they simply can't anymore. They will die from starvation, trapped in a cycle where they desperately want to live but are completely unable to force themselves to eat. I worked on a general med-surg floor, and we were essentially the medical, psych floor. We treated patients who were medically too unwell to be placed on a psych floor, and once they were stable, they would be transferred. I'll never forget one particular patient. They had actually worked on the floor before I started, so I often ended up being their nurse since I hadn't known them prior to their breakdown. This person had been horribly mistreated by their father and managed to keep things together until they had their own children. That's when they experienced a complete emotional breakdown, leading to multiple self-harm attempts. They were often found by their partner after these incidents and placed on a mental health hold. The incident I remember most vividly occurred after they had been discharged following an attempt to hurt themselves. Their partner found them struggling with another harmful action, and they were quickly brought back to the hospital, where they became unresponsive. When someone is at risk of harming themselves, they are assigned constant supervision, meaning someone is with them around the clock. They had been improving, so they weren't in physical restraints at that point. Right at the end of my shift, the patient suddenly bolted upright and tried to run for the exit. The poor CNA was struggling to keep up, and even when I grabbed hold of them, they kept pushing forward. Despite being much larger, this fragile person was still moving steadily towards the door. It took several staff members and medical intervention to get them back into bed and ensure their safety. During this time, the charge nurse and others who had known the patient before were crying, pleading with them to stop, but the patient just had a distant, empty look. There was nothing there except a desperate need to escape and cause harm to themselves. I had to call their partner to inform them of what happened. The partner sounded utterly exhausted, so overwhelmed by the responsibility of raising their children and trying to care for their partner, all within a system that, unfortunately, doesn't seem to provide the care they need. There were many mornings after night shifts where I cried on the train ride home, but this was one of the times I sobbed the hardest.
Young kids are the hardest for me. I had a 5-year-old who, unfortunately, tried to harm a staff member. He concealed a knife and held a paraprofessional, who was in a wheelchair, from behind with the knife near her neck. He said that his brain was telling him to do it. This child was incredibly strong for his age, weighing almost as much as the staff member, and he was extremely determined. If they hadn't been in earshot of others, the situation could have been much worse. Thinking about children who pose a risk to adults is really difficult. We were familiar with his family background, and this wasn't a reaction to his environment, it was simply what was happening in his mind. He had to live with those thoughts every day. It may not have been as physically dangerous as an adult overpowering someone, but the emotional weight of the situation is heartbreaking in its own way.
I didn't specifically work in mental health, but I did work in a long-term care facility, a nursing home. I worked on the secure unit, which mostly housed seniors with varying stages of dementia. The average age of the residents was likely in their early to mid-80s. One day, we had a new resident move in who had Korsakoff syndrome. This is a type of dementia caused by long-term alcohol use, and it was pretty advanced. She couldn't tell us where she was or what day it was. What made it even harder to see was that she was only 34 years old. Dementia is an incredibly painful condition, but knowing that hers was preventable and caused by actions earlier in life made it even more heart-wrenching. And to make matters worse, the system couldn't provide her with the right support anywhere else, so she was forced to live out her young life in a nursing home. It was truly sad.
I'm a bit late, but this was my hardest experience. A husband and wife from the US adopted 2 children from another country, a sister, who was around 7 years old at the time, and her younger brother, who was around 2. The sister, unfortunately, caused harm to the family pets. She strangled the family cat and dog to death and left both of them on her parents' bed for them to find. There was no remorse, no empathy, no sadness. She calmly told me about her time in long-term care facilities and mentioned how a nurse was afraid of her. She seemed almost prideful in her tone. In a very flat, unremarkable voice, she said she was planning to harm her brother next. She was in and out of long-term care after that point. Her parents had to lock her door from the outside, and they had to make their home incredibly secure for older kids, no sharp objects, locked silverware drawers, and no scissors anywhere. This case really took an emotional toll on me. After that first session, I went home and cried. The adoptive parents did everything they could to help: therapy, tutors, a great home and school, and they were open to communication. They tried their best, but sometimes, even with all that effort, things don't work out as hoped. I eventually left the field, but I truly hope that they're all much happier and healthier now.